to give some context for our listeners, we wanted to start with a brief history of BRICS. This all started 15 years ago with a summit in Russia with Brazil, India, and China. South Africa officially joining the following year. Marco, what is BRICS? How has it evolved? What's the agenda? And also, could you explain the significance of this project?
So BRICS actually started in a very, I would say, humble way, because it was actually a Russian initiative at the beginning. They started having some meetings between the representatives of Brazil, Russia, India, and China at IMF, because the impression that they had at that point is that the countries were growing in importance, economic, political, geopolitically. But the perception of all of them is that their voices were not being particularly heard in international multilateral organizations like IMF, like World Bank, and even the United Nations, organizations that we know at the end of the day, they are controlled by the West. So that was the common perception that led Russia to propose some side meetings among the representatives at the IMF in 2006. I mean, there's a lot of discussion that, oh, actually, this was an acronym, was created by this Goldman Sachs guy, Jim O'Neill, in 2001, saying, oh, this is the economies that are going to drive the growth in the next decades, etc. But I mean, okay, he got this, but actually what happened is that Russia, one more time, had a very important initiative, and they start to meet. So this was 2006 and 2009. You have, as you said, the first summit in Ekaterinburg in Russia. And then in 2011, we have South Africa joining BRICS. I think at the beginning, it was like a more, okay, we need to reform global governance. I think this is still one of the main topics for BRICS, but I think now we're going to talk later. I think its ambition are becoming bigger. So again, in 2000, as the first years of BRICS, there were very important progresses in the organization. And I would say in 2012, was the first time that they had the proposal to create a bank, the New Development Bank. And actually, this was an initiative of India, which, by the way, I think is also important to remind that when BRICS is created, we had Lula in Brazil, we had Singham, Prime Minister from Congress Party in India. And of course, we had, actually, when it was created in Russia, we have Medvedev there, and Putin was Prime Minister. And we have Hu Jintao in China. But I'm just reminding this because this also explains some of the bumpy road of BRICS in the middle of last decade. But again, so India has the proposal for the bank, and Brazil and China actually had the proposal to create the contingent reserve arrangement, which is supposed to be an alternative to IMF. We can go back to this because I think it's one of the examples of how some of the potentials of BRICS are still untapped even today. So in 2014, in the Brazil summit, they create New Development Bank and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement officially. And I think this is a very important historical mark for BRICS because these are the two only institutions, quote unquote, that BRICS has created so far. As you know, BRICS doesn't have a secretariat or something like that. There's no like a headquarter, which I think, by the way, I think is also a problem. I think this is something that BRICS will have to face this challenge in the next years. But anyways, I would say the main achievement of BRICS so far is the creation of both the bank and the arrangement. But then what happened is that 2014, Modi won elections in India. 2016, Dilma is overthrown by like a parliamentary coup d'etat in Brazil. And then you have BRICS in a very tough situation because Brazil was actually the main key driver at the beginning. One of the recommendations at the end would be a book about BRICS history, because we can see that even Russia, I think today is probably the key driver of BRICS, the most interested on BRICS. But for instance, Russia was not in favor of creation of the bank, neither the arrangement at the beginning. They were convinced, especially by Brazil and China and India for the bank. But I'm just saying this because I think it was also important in this moment. I think BRICS is starting to leave a new chapter, a new important chapter of its history. I think it's also important at this point we go back in time to understand some of the developments and also understand why BRICS had at some point sort of slowed down its development. And I would say from 2014 almost to 2021, 22, the beginning of this decade, I think BRICS had a sort of like got stuck. And of course, finally for closing this question, I think it's clear that especially since the initial of the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, and in the last year, the massacre in Palestine, I think this also explains how most of the global South countries now realize that BRICS is probably the most important institution that they have to push, they have to join, and they have to support. But again, it's a very complex challenge, and I think there's still a lot of work ahead for making BRICS a real strong, solid institution. But I think the idea is there, and it's the best idea that we had, I think, since the Bandung Conference in 1955, and then the creation of the non-aligned movement in 1961 in Belgrade in Yugoslavia. I think BRICS, of course, is the most important thing that we had so far. And lastly, I also, just to tease you, we can come back to this question. I think we also have to pay attention again to the history of OPEC. For those who don't know, this is an organization of the petrol export countries. It was the only organization of the third world that was able at some point to shift the correlation of forces regarding the imperialist powers, especially the companies, the multinational companies from US and Europe that control the market of oil. And I think BRICS should learn something with this experience in the next years.